Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. In the past 10 years or so, international film audiences have grown to understand the magnitude of accomplishment of the cinemas of China. That's also given us an opportunity to look backward into the history of Chinese cinema. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be looking at the 1949 production, Crows and Sparrows. This is a film that if you want a touchstone, say, within American cinema, I would look to the William Wyler films such as Dead End or The Best Years of Our Lives, ensemble pieces that give us an extraordinary portrait of an historical moment in a society. The moment here is Shanghai on the verge of the communist takeover. We'll be talking about that, the film's place in film history, and a lot of other things today after today's screening. It's a pleasure to have back on City Cinematheque Richard Pena of the Film Society of Lincoln Center. Now, enjoy this rare opportunity to see the 1949 film, Crows and Sparrows. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. The film you've just seen, I think, is one that helps us change our concept of what the canon of film history is, because most people, when they think of the late 40s, think of film noir in America, Italian neorealism, perhaps the discovery of Japanese cinema. But when you see a film like this, it reminds us perhaps how much we still don't know about film history. To help us with some of that issue and some others is somebody who knows a great deal about film history. Returning to City Cinematheque, it's always a pleasure to have Richard Pena, well known to many of our audience members as the director of the program of the Film Center of Lincoln Center, Film Society of Lincoln Center. Richard, I know that.
You got it.
A number of people probably don't know that you also teach film studies at Columbia University and have done so for a number of years. Richard, you've been involved for a number of years. You've made a number of trips to China, as well as seeing Chinese cinema, not only as you've programmed it at Lincoln Center, but in international festivals. It's been an extraordinary 10 or 15 years for us in the West, looking at what they've been doing recently, but also that past. Locate a little bit for us, how to put it, what we have known about Chinese cinema and what we haven't known about Chinese cinema. I mean,
well, let's see. I guess to start off, one would have to say that a film like Crows and Sparrows is really a film that's at the tail end of something, which is an extraordinary film movement which began in the early 1930s, even the late 20s, principally around the city of Shanghai, and sort of grew to maturity in the late 30s and 37 when the bombing of Shanghai began. The industry pretty much collapsed, and some of it went into Yan'an to join up with Mao. Some of it went different places and hid or did what they could. There's only sporadic feature production during the 1940s, and then following the war, production came back in earnest. And this, in many ways, is really the flower of the sort of post-war period prior to the actual takeover by the People's Liberation Army, which happened literally months. In fact, the film was begun while the Kuomintang was still in power in Shanghai. It was hidden every night. There was kind of a false script that was submitted to the censors. And then when the film was finally completed, by then the People's Liberation Army was in control of Shanghai, and the film was released to great acclaim.
Right, and one should say that this is a legendary film in the sense that a number of commentators who had the opportunity to see it at the time of its making or of its release said this is really a landmark in Chinese cinema. It's a landmark in that it stands equal to anything that's being produced in world cinema at this particular moment. But of course then, given the complexities and some of the tragedies of Chinese history and political relations, our access to so many materials in essence disappeared for years. So a film of this stature can really just be a citation in a book for many, many years. And now we've had the pleasure of recovering something like this, and so it can be seen not only by Chinese audiences, but gosh, by the viewers of City Cinematheque.
Right. Well, I think for many people in the West, their first real exposure to Chinese cinema came with Jay Leida's book, published, I believe, in the early 1970s,
That's
called
correct.
Diane Ying, Electric Shadows, which was based on his long years of working in China, and basically was the first time that one learned of any kind of serious production having gone on prior to 1949, whatever. In the late 1970s, there were a series of important festivals, principally in Europe. One thinks of at Pesaro, the Electric Shadows Festival that was organized by Marco Müller in the late 1970s. There was also a similar program organized by Tony Raines and Scott Meek at the National Film Theatre as part of the British
Right.
Film Institute. And bit by bit, some of that work began to filter into the United States. There was a small festival of Chinese films, I believe in 1980 at the San Francisco Film Festival. So bit by bit, these films made their way into the, how could you say, American festival circuit. But as I think you imply, they really haven't had the impact perhaps they deserve because,
Exactly.
in fact, they haven't really been seen by Western audiences or Western students. I know when I've shown this film in classes, people are often shocked that a level of cinema this sophisticated existed in China, you know, and then I say, well, wait till you see what they were doing in 36, you know. Indeed, I think it is always a revelation for people.
Good, good. Let's talk just a little bit about further. I mean, you've already given us a kind of basis of what the circumstances of production were, but this is one of those very interesting examples of cinema which duplicates, this is not exactly a neorealist film, but it duplicates one of the aesthetic principles of neorealism that continues to live on today, and that is making a production in as close a historical proximity to the conditions that you're trying to show as well. And this is an act of filmmaking that is about what was actually happening and a major set of historical shifts within the society that was happening as they were producing and writing the film. Who are the people who were working on this film, and give us a little bit more of the background of this change, these social conditions that are the motivating force behind all of these characters. Because this is an example of a film that's about characters who are acting in very specific ways because of the specific moment and place in history they're inserted.
Let me go back, if I may, really 30 years, because I think the true origin of a work like Crows and Sparrows goes back to the June 4th, 1919, May 4th, 1919 riots in Shanghai and other cities around China that were at first protests by students, largely by students, against the concessions made to the Japanese by the Versailles Treaty.
Right.
But what this really signaled was a new generation in China now kind of tired of the continuing idea of China as a kind of tired giant, as a kind of weak and feeble kingdom. No longer was it the center of civilization, as many Chinese believe it should be. So this new generation, the May 4th generation, as it's often called,
Right.
of artists and intellectuals, writers, people like Lu Xun, the great Chinese writer, and others who came out of this movement, were really led by two instincts. One was the fact that somehow China really had to learn all the stuff that the West had developed, because in many ways, clearly, it had led the West to a tremendous position of power in the world. So this led to an incredible hunger on the part of Chinese intellectuals in anything Western, anything foreign, really. After many decades of really shunning the foreign, now there was a kind of almost ravenous appetite for anything, be it Marxism, be it psychoanalysis, be it surrealism, be it traditional concepts of Western realism in theater, name it.
Yeah.
There were people trying to do it. The other side of the May 4th generation was really a kind of sense of, let's go back and reassess Chinese culture and see what from it we can still use and what from it we have to abandon. And I think in many ways, Crows and Sparrows is a very interesting combination of both those things. That's why it doesn't really fit the rules or fit. It's not clearly a neorealist work.
Exactly.
It's not clearly anything because, in fact, you have a group of artists, intellectuals who are supremely well informed, not only of their own Chinese traditions, but of Western traditions as well. And they're picking and choosing very much as they like. For example, certainly in the style of acting and much of the kind of mimetic quality, it's really taken from, I really think, Hollywood films of the 30s. People like Frank Borzage were enormously popular among Chinese intellectuals at that time. There were versions of Street Angel and other films by Borzage, kind of thinly disguised, that were made at that time. At the same time, there are elements that one finds in a lot of traditional Chinese literature and narrative making. The very strong use of allegory. Clearly, the house is a metaphor for China.
Right.
And there's even a topographical kind of, identity to it, with the Kuomintang at the top, the middle level down, the sort of teacher, scholar, intellectual, and on the bottom, the kind of poor peasant, or the peasant who sleeps on the stairs, the small trader, the man who works in the printing shop. One really gets in that house a whole vision of China.
The kind of thing we see in American cinema in World War II in things like Howard Hawks' Air Force,
Right,
or,
where you have
or
the
they, were
mixed- exactly.
they were expendable by John Ford, in which we bring this group of people together. And I
Right.
bring that up because, again, there is that echo with American cinema there very strongly that just antecedent to this. But please go on.
No,
Richard.
so that strong tendency towards allegory, I think, is very, very important. I mean, these are filmmakers who see themselves, or artists, I should say, who see themselves very much involved in an active struggle to change society. Their work has a certain didactic quality, although it's immensely enjoyable and wonderfully well done. They want to teach a lesson in many ways. There are a lot of other elements, even the kind of use of the multi-character story, the way the narrative shifts from family to family, group to group. In many ways, that's very reminiscent of a Chinese aesthetic principle that one finds in Chinese painting called yao, a sense of touring and roaming, not having a central thesis or theme, but in fact allowing the viewer to visit different sites, different stories, check in at different times. Again, there are examples of that within the Western tradition, but it is also something that is derived very strongly from Chinese tradition as well.
Well, that's one of those instances of something that turns out to be a pleasantly syncretic aspect, that you can draw it from traditional Chinese culture, but then it also corresponds with this whole European notion of the French de flaneur who wanders around and observes things, or any number of modernist narrative structures, anything from Dos Passos, USA, cutting across different storylines or around a city to get different experiences. So you get the two flowing into one in that way. And again, illustrating your point about finding this balance between what you can use from the traditional past and what you can use from the new explorations there. I think the political moment is one that's worth dwelling on as well, because the moment that's actually represented here is a moment that's not been, for the West, overrepresented in the cinema. That is the change. That is, there, generally speaking, in the West, if you're talking about popular culture, it is, well, there was the moment of World War II, and then they were our allies, but there were two sides, and then they split up, there was a civil war, and then all of a sudden there's Taiwan and this. This is about a time in which the balance is shifting, or at least people's perception of exactly where the balance is has shifted. And one of the things we see throughout the film is those differing perceptions as the events unfold, that it's not that there's a uniform opinion about how things have shifted. People have different sources of information, so that obviously the man living on the top floor has one source of information. His contacts directly in the government that will then go into exile and form Taiwan, whereas Little Broadcast and his family have another flow of information about things, which is the flow of information from the street vendors themselves. But it's very interesting to put a film in the moment of transition instead of on either side of it. And also, the film ends, obviously, with the transition coming into place. But I think it's well for us to remember that part of its optimism has also to do with the fact that it is the genuine optimism of the filmmakers who have not experienced any of that future at all.
Well, there are a couple of things in line in what you said. First of all, it's important to see that at the end of the film, everybody goes back into the house. Obviously, Monkey and his wife,
Right.
the official, have gone away, but everyone goes in. That is, the professor and his wife, Little Broadcast and his wife, all their various children, Old Kong, Mei Li, the young maid
Right,
girl,
right.
the peasant girl from the provinces. Everybody's welcome back into the House of China. This is precisely what would have gotten a film like Crows and Sparrows into a lot of trouble even a few years later. Because in fact what that represents is a vision of a very broad-based coalition, of a coalition that includes small
Right.
tradespeople, that includes intellectuals, that includes everybody. Everybody's welcome back in China. Within a few years, the notion of what to do with problematic characters, such as, say, Little Broadcast,
Indeed.
would really come to the fore, because how can you let someone like this in, who's kind of a black market dealer, smuggler, trading in, cans of Carnation instant milk and all these kinds of things? This is a very objectionable character in many ways. And indeed, in the 50s, and even more so in the 60s with the
Absolutely.
Cultural Revolution, the fate of characters like this would become quite tragic. And indeed, even having characters like that in your background could be a very dangerous thing.
Yeah.
In a way, I think it's important to remember that in 37, even a little before then, but the sort of broad-based left, anti-government, nationalists, left in China, really split into sort of two groups. One was the group that went to Yan'an and really signed up with Mao and the Communist Party, became part of that program. Then there was the other part that sort of remained in and around Shanghai. And the in and around Shanghai group was always much more broad-based, much more kind of popular front coalition, as opposed to the people who went to Yan'an, who clearly became very much under the wing of the Communist Party and tended to be much more doctrinaire in their
Right.
visions of kind of exemplary characters and things like that.
Well, one of the things it might be worth talking about just for a minute is the actual work of this particular filmmaker, because this was his first feature film, and he made a number afterwards. But and you've seen those. I have not. Tell us a little bit about him, the films that follow, and then his place. I mean, what happened to him within the flow of Chinese history?
Well, what's interesting is that there were a number of companies in Shanghai that were privately owned companies, but that were considered progressive, nationalist, left-wing kind of companies. The major one of which was Kunlun, the company that produced Crows and Sparrows. They were allowed to remain in independent production for a number of years. And to think it wasn't until about 52, 53 that the industry was completely nationalized. Right. Prior to that point, the idea was that these progressive companies could continue to make films, whatever. There was a famous case in, I think it was 53, in which the actor who plays Little Broadcast, Zhao Dan, certainly to my mind one of the great actors of film history, an extraordinary figure, was involved in a film. I wish I knew the exact sort of the exemplary life of scientist Wu. And it was a film about a very famous Chinese educator who in the 19th century made great efforts to try and set up different school systems and educate peasants and teach people how to read and write and whatever. And the film was roundly condemned, and there's even a belief that some of the articles attacking the film were co-authored or authored by Mao Zedong himself, that this was precisely the kind of film that was not needed, that this was a kind of reformist film, this was the kind of film showing that there was sort of goodwill in the bourgeoisie towards the peasants and others, when in fact history has shown us much the opposite. So indeed this kind of more liberal, broad-based, coalition thinking that had characterized so much of the Shanghai school very much fell out of favor in the 50s, when you might say there was the ascendancy of the Yan'an wing of the artistic community.
Right. And what does the work differ stylistically that you've seen later, or does it?
I find it very, very similar in the sense that the work takes on a kind of what you might say, still steeped very much in a kind of tradition of what you'd call, Western realism in terms of, again, stories often very allegorical. Characters are given less to giving speeches than they might be in some other Chinese films at that time. More things come out with dramatic conflict. Again, I think they're good examples of work that sort of takes from different traditions, both from traditional Chinese modes of storytelling and very much from Hollywood and other kinds of Western models.
Yeah.
Again, though, as you mentioned, I mean, after 49, the memory that these people had of Hollywood films was all they could go on. I mean, there was very little, it wasn't really, I think, until about 57, 58 when there was a big show of Italian neo-realist films in China, that essentially that whole sort of decade of world cinema was not seen by anyone in China. And even after that was seen in quite a sporadic way up until the fall of the Gang of Four and the sort of opening up of China in the 1980s.
Well, I think it'd be very interesting, since Chinese film history is known so sporadically in the West, and certainly it's not discussed so much in popular journalism. I mean, one may get a review of a new film coming out, but usually the reviews have to do with what are the, character qualities or aesthetic qualities of it, not really this longer term context. So I think for most people, their experience of Chinese cinema really begins sometime in the late 80s through 90s, and we're talking now about the cinema of the People's Republic of China. The cinemas of Taiwan, the cinema of Hong Kong, and the cinema of a Chinese diasporic directors. Those are other subjects, wealthy subjects indeed. But let's get some way from this period of the late 40s, 50s to the moment, let us say in the mid-80s, perfectly, when the fifth generation materials burst upon the screens in the Berlin Film Festival and the Cannes Film Festival. All of a sudden the world is saying, "Way, there's something going on there." What happens? We've got 35 years, and those 35 years have some distinct periods in them.
Right.
Let's just sort of, I think it's interesting to review that to see, because this is a moment in which we seem to be seeing something very, very vital. There's been the terrible problem of the war, but somehow there seems to be a cinema emerging out of that. What are some of the big markers that go along in those 35 years, and what happens to the film production?
In many ways, film production was very much subject to, as one can imagine, the kind of waxing and waning of the moods of the various officials in power, most specifically Mao Zedong. So that in the early years, say from 49 till about 55, 56, there's kind of this struggle between, as I mentioned, these two tendencies, the more doctrinaire Communist Party tendency and then the sort of former, more broad-based coalition one. That changes slightly after the 100 Flowers speech in 1956, when there is suddenly given a little bit of an open door so that films such as Before the New Director Comes, which is a kind of inspector general sort of set, in a Chinese factory, or City at Night, which is a film about a progressive factory owner in Shanghai who is forced to watch as his business is taken over by the new government, but learns to accept it and become part of, the new China and things like that, and several other films which come out at that time. By the early 1960s, this sort of more open wing began to come under attack increasingly by different kinds of party officials. In a way, a film you're going to have later on, Two Stage Sisters, which is an extraordinary masterpiece, is another kind of fascinating film, because here you have much of the energy and ideas involved in, say, a film like Crows and Sparrows, a kind of combination of elements, with a much greater emphasis on finding a sort of Chinese film form that would draw from Chinese opera, because one of the kind of criticisms would be that these films were too slavishly copying Western models and things like that. And Two Stage Sisters is a fascinating hybrid of an attempt to sort of find cinematic equivalents for Shaoxing opera specifically. Following that film, which was released in a sort of minor way in '64, from '65 really till the early '70s, there's almost no film production. With the coming of the Cultural Revolution, the film studios are pretty much closed. And it's only in '70, '71 that they begin to come back, first as vehicles for filming model operas. Remember, there were, I think, 18 or so officially approved operas by the cultural department at that time. And they were allowed to be filmed in whatever, usually quite static versions. Beginning about '71, '72, you get people like, say, Shi Jin, who had made Two Stage Sisters and then had been disgraced during the Cultural Revolution, allowed to come back and sort of work in the film industry once again. And there are some films which, come out from that time. It's actually a period that perhaps needs to be studied a little more. I don't know what cinematic riches we'll find, but I think we'll find some fascinating works.
Yeah.
Probably the most well-known of the films to have emerged from that Cultural Revolution cinema is a film called Breaking with Old Ideas, which for many years was shown in various Spartacus League and other kinds of political group meetings. It's a fascinating movie in many ways. It's about someone who comes to try and reform a rural college and the opposition he finds, and in the end they get a letter from Mao sort of supporting the methods of the this guy who's come in to reform it, and that solves everything.
Right, sure.
So it's kind of a very interesting film in that way. After the fall of the Gang of Four, the studio system returned more or less back to normal in a way. But sort of the great change was you had this new generation which came in, which had largely been, especially in the class that entered into the Beijing Film Academy in '78, largely composed of people who had especially suffered during the Cultural Revolution.
Right.
That is, they tended to be from families that were well-connected or intellectuals or whatever, so they became the first targets, and many of them were sent down to farms or sent into the army or different things like that. And that's really the story of people like Chen Kaige, Zhang Yimou, Chang Zhuangzhuang, several other people. So they were entered into that first class, and in China Film School, a class comes in, say in '78, and stays there for 4 years. No other class comes in.
Right.
So that was the fifth such group to enter the Beijing Film Academy. So it became known as the fifth generation of Chinese filmmakers.
And those are the films such as Yellow Earth, such as Farewell My Concubine, such as Red Sorghum, that are this big explosion of Chinese cinema. We're going to have to end with the fifth generation because we've run through our 30 minutes worth of time. Well, China's a big country and it's a big industry, Richard. If you'd like more information about City Cinematheque, drop us a line. Drop it to City Cinematheque, City University Television, 25 West 43rd Street, Suite 1220, New York, New York, 10036. Let me give you that information again. Drop it to City Cinematheque, City University Television, 25 West 43rd Street, Suite 1220, New York, New York, 10036. It's a big country, Richard, but I think we've covered a lot of ground in 30 minutes, and I think our audience knows that if we invited you back for another 30 minutes, which you will be always, we'd have a lot more to talk about Chinese cinema and a lot of other things. Thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Always a pleasure to have you here.
All right.
And thanks to you at home for joining us, and we hope that you tune in to see more of our special series in the history of Chinese cinema. Thanks for joining us today. Hope to see you next time around. Bye-bye.